The grave topic of war and national security is back in the headlines as we record this segment with the attack on Saudi Arabian oil resources, the drone attack that was originally attributed to Houthi rebels in Yemen is now, according to the Trump administration and the Mohammed bin Salman administration in Saudi Arabia, being attributed instead to Iran. There are once again the drums of war beating to conduct some sort of attack against Iran. What is really going on? What should we as citizens know about it? What should we as citizens be doing about it? Here to talk about all of that and perhaps more is our friend Stephen Miles. I will remind you that Stephen is the executive director of Win Without War. He is a longtime activist. He's been working on these issues for a long time, and he joins us now. So first of all, Stephen, thanks for coming back on the program.
Happy to be here.
Secondly, okay, Iran, Saudi Arabia, rebels, what do we know exactly? What's a reasonable person as opposed to, let's say, a national security establishment person? What's a reasonable person to believe is going on right at this moment?
Well, I think you hit the highlights of the events that we saw play out over the last week, which was last weekend. A Saudi oil refinery and another facility were hit with an attack, causing a temporary loss in Saudi oil production capacity. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, one of the largest oil producers on the planet, that had a disruptive effect on the markets. And since then, we've seen both a claim, as you said, by the Houthi rebels, who, it should be said and not forgotten, are fighting a war against the Saudis intervened in Yemen and quite brutally against the Houthis, and the Houthis, lots of blood on their own hands, but a kind of backdrop there. But obviously, we've seen the Trump administration jump into the fray, talking about Iran's culpability and the potential, and pointing the finger directly at Tehran, leaking and quoting anonymously that they believe this goes all the way up to the supreme leader. But I think if folks really want to understand what's happening, if folks ask themselves, what do I need to know? I think the number one thing that you need to know is that Donald Trump has turned the Middle East into a raging inferno right now. Donald Trump inherited a Middle East that for a long time has had a lot of kindling sitting around, waiting to turn into a fire. His administration looked around, poured gasoline all over that kindling, and now we're one spark away, not from a fire, but from an inferno.
So I want to, of course, get to that because nothing could be, very few things are more important than that right now. I just want to I struggle with, I think a lot of people struggle with, what we know about the attack on the Saudi oil fields is, what we know, as opposed to what's been asserted, is that word is it was conducted by drones. So I guess the logical first question is, could the Houthi rebels conceivably have gotten drone technology capable of carrying out this level of destruction without the intervention of some other government? I mean, I guess that's the first question. Do we know?
Well, like you said, we need to separate what we know from what has been insinuated or claimed. What we know is that this operation was claimed by the Houthis. As you mentioned, they do in fact have drones and cruise missiles, and we know this because they've been using them to attack Saudi Arabia and UAE as part of this ongoing conflict. We know that this is within the range of the weapons that they claim to have. Now, the administration has said that they don't believe the particular weapons that were used are in the Houthis' arsenal, but we can't know that exactly for sure. But again, the question here is a little bit not who exactly did this, although that's certainly important. We're on the precipice of war once again, as we were when we found ourselves earlier this summer, because of one thing, and that's because of the escalation and the conflict, race towards conflict that we're seeing from this administration.
So, and I want to talk about that too, because you mentioned that the Middle East was a tinderbox was a tinderbox when the Trump administration took it. I can't help thinking as I hear the stories. Obviously, I don't know the story of where these drones came from or how they were able to do this, but here's what I do know. Lies, government lies, were used to justify the war in Vietnam, including the Gulf of Tonkin, the Bay of Resolution, based on, the logic behind that was built on lie. Lies were used to justify the United States invasion of Iraq, which was a pretty big, enormous conflagration of its own under President George W. Bush. That continued on in various forms, gradually de-escalating somewhat under Obama, but we continue to have drone attacks under Obama. We continue to have these other problems. Now here we get the United States, which was helping the Saudis conduct its wholesale slaughter in Yemen, which the UN General Secretary, as you know, has called the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet. We were actively helping them with that during Obama administration. That help was accelerated by Donald Trump. Now we get a story without verification. Forgive me if I'm skeptical, if I'm going to need evidence before I see us go and take on take on Iran rather. I mean, the Iraq War was a disaster. Iran is 4 times as large, and I guess where I'm going with all this, Stephen, is that I'm not seeing enough voices in the media saying, "Well, wait a minute, hold on." I'm seeing a lot of voices calling for war. And if anything, I'm seeing some voices even on the Democratic side saying, I don't know if this Trump is willing enough to act, rather than what I want to hear are voices saying, I want to know the truth before we decide what to do.
Yeah, look, I think there's really 3 things at play here. I think you hit one of them on the head and you talked about it. There's a long history of misinformation and outright lies when it comes to the U.S. and the beginning of military misadventures, whether that's Vietnam or whether that's Iraq. We also, I think a lot about, we've gotten pretty well trained lately to learn that, this is a horrible thing to have been trained in, but we've had this series of mass shootings in America. And we've learned through that information that we hear right away is so often wrong. And yet it goes quickly viral. You hear it all over the place. People hear lots of things. That happens on the international stage too, right? So there's a lot of misinformation that gets out there. There's a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. It's always a good idea to take some time, wait, get a little bit of patience, and find the facts out. And then I think you have to look at the third angle, which is this is an administration that's relationship with the truth is tenuous, to say the least. This week we saw the president's former campaign manager testifying in Congress openly about how he would repeatedly lie to the nation's media as part of his job. And so, we have to assume that this administration, unfortunately, is not telling the truth. They've lied repeatedly about Iran, whether that was Mike Pompeo, both now as Secretary of State and previously as the CIA, trumpeting up these kinds of false connections between al-Qaeda and Iran, the exact same kind of thing we saw the Bush administration do. We certainly have seen them be less than truthful on all sorts of things that really are big and small. And so they've not earned the right, for anyone's benefit of the doubt. They've burned their credibility on the international stage. This president had his own administration publicly, the kind of functional parts of the government, agreeing with everyone else in the world that the Iranians were abiding by their commitments under the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, only to go out and say, no, we think they're lying. The administration had the most ridiculous thing they said was the Iranians were violating the JCPOA before we even signed the JCPOA. Right? The notion that they were somehow in violation of a deal before it existed is the level of dishonesty and misinformation that we're getting from this administration. So no, they absolutely haven't earned anyone's trust on this. They haven't earned the benefit of the doubt at all. And everyone should be asking that, not just because that they're dishonest and untrustworthy themselves, but because of the history on this issue, and because once you go down this road, it's hard to come back. Once the missiles are launched, once the war begins, you can't come back later and say, you know what, we got it wrong. Let's undo that. Let's go back. The stakes couldn't be higher, and we need to be demanding every last ounce of truth.
And again, we're talking with Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War. I think your three-point list is very clear, Stephen, and I appreciate it. I would just add one point to it, though. The other dimension of this story is Donald Trump's personal relationship with Saudi Arabia and with the rulers of Saudi Arabia. Now we're talking about Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who has been linked to the murder and dismemberment of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and other atrocities and torture and so on. You know, very bad individual. I've personally long felt that the impeachment investigations of Donald Trump and so on should have focused on his relationships with Saudi long ago, but he appears, we don't know what those relationships, where they might go financially and otherwise, but he appears for a long time to have had a very cozy relationship with the leaders of that country. And he even said, tweeted recently that let's wait and see what Mohammed bin Salman says, and then we'll act. And since when do we let leaders of any other country dictate for us whether we should or shouldn't act? I mean, I thought we get information on our own and respond accordingly in our own best interest. But don't you think that's a factor, Trump and Saudi Arabia and all of this, or you think I'm off base?
No, I think you're 100% right. I think you have to ask the question, particularly given this president, particularly given what we know. You don't have to speculate about this stuff. Donald Trump this week, sitting in the Oval Office, said that why he was considering this was, quote, the Saudis pay cash. Right? This is a man who has a personal financial connection to Saudi Arabia. When he had financial trouble earlier in his life, at one point, they bailed him out by buying his yacht. We found out from a report in Politico this week that a group of 25 Saudis were staying at his resort in Turnberry, Scotland. We know that Saudis have spent lavishly at his other properties. We know that there are questions that are largely unanswered about the potential role, I should say, of the Saudis and the UAE and other potential Gulf states in foreign influence operations during the 2016 presidential election. That was a distinct part of the Mueller report. You know, there's a lot of attention paid to Russia, but when Eric Prince was meeting in the Seychelles with the Russians, he was doing it at the request and at the hotel of the UAE government official. And so we know there's deep connections there. We know that whatever the heck is going on with Jared Kushner and MBS goes far beyond anything that's normal. You know, reports of them texting each other late into the night. There's so much smoke there that it's not even a case of where there's smoke, there's fire. I mean, this goes just so far beyond that. So you're absolutely right. It has to be a question about this. There's a really interesting part that I think this brings up, though, which is, you know, the president, as you said, pointed and said, I'm waiting to see what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia says we should do with our military. This is actually literally why the framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers of our country, did not put the power to make and declare war in the hands of a president. They lived in a time of kings and queens. They knew that the power to go to war was not something to be trusted to one individual, that individuals tended to have these corrupt relationships. They would get into petty grudges with other folks. They would make their personal politics be the thing that decided whether or not we went to war. So they put that power in the hands of Congress exclusively. They said this should be Congress's responsibility. And that's the case here. It is Congress's sole responsibility as the part of government that has to answer most closely to us, the American public, about whether or not we should be going to war. So the notion that the president gets to decide, let alone that the president is going to give his decision over to a foreign official who he may or may not have business relationships with, we could not be further away from the express purpose that the founding fathers put this power in Congress than we are today.
So I always ask this question, Stephen Miles, when we're talking about an issue like this, which is what can people do what can citizens do about something like this? And to me, part of the answer might be to contact their representatives and senators and say, I want you to speak up against any military action against Iran that's unilaterally undertaken by this administration. I want you to demand that Congress assert its role, war-making role in this matter. That's something that occurs to me just talking about it. Is there anything else?
No, look, that's the number one thing. And members of Congress don't just have to stand up and say what they want. Earlier this summer, as both the House and the Senate were working their way through what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, the annual defense policy bill, the bill that sets our defense policy as a country, both in the House and the Senate, they had votes on a provision that would bar the president from using funds to take military action against Iran that was not authorized by Congress. That passed in the House, and it had a bipartisan majority in the Senate that fell just short of the 60 votes needed to incorporate it in the bill. But in both chambers, bipartisan majorities here, both Republicans and Democrats came together and said, we want to make this law. It is already the law that the president can't start a war on his own, but we want to make it clear this is a belt and suspenders situation. We want to bar the use of funds because this president has done all sorts of things that are clearly against the law. And so we want to make sure that it is unequivocally the case that the president cannot launch military action against Iran. Right now, they're deciding whether to include that provision in the must-pass NDAA. They're meeting literally as we speak. Your members of Congress can hear, you can call them, you can tell them to support that provision. It's section 1229 of the NDAA. It was the Khanna-Gates amendment by Ro Khanna and Matt Gaetz, a Democrat and Republican in the House. And you can make your voice heard. You can go to our website, winwithoutwar.org, and find out how to do that. But you can also just pick up the phone and call your representative, call your senator, tell them now, right now, for exactly this reason, it's the time to make clear that there is no authorization to go to war with Iran, that you don't want this country to go to war with Iran, and that they need to block the president from doing just that.
All right. Well, I think that's great advice. And Stephen Miles, we didn't even have a chance to talk about the paper you guys just put out on reimagining U.S. security spending for the 21st century and beyond, which looks terrific. So I guess we're just going to have you back if you're willing. But this is such an important topic. Thanks for updating us on it. And thanks for coming on the program.
Glad to be here. And let's hope we all make it through and cooler heads prevail on this issue.
Absolutely.